Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand that this evening we're going to return once again to one of the subjects that seems, strangely enough, to be most popular, namely the psychology of sex. So, who would like to begin with the first question? Yes.
Mr. Branden, what kinds of sexual problems would a person of religious background be likely to encounter?
Well, taking your question literally, I would have to say virtually every sexual problem that one can name. I can't think of any single cultural source more responsible for the sexual hang-ups that people can have than the influence of religion. Let me sketch out briefly some of the main ways in which this can work. Religion in the Western world has many targets. It's against this earth, it's against sex, it's against the enjoyment of life on earth. It's also against human self-assertiveness, inasmuch as it counsels humility and the smallness of man and the smallness of man's mind. Any doctrines which tend to downgrade the body or to teach that the concerns of the body are low or evil or depraved obviously tend to generate, on the part of those who accept such beliefs, problems associated with sex. Guilt, a sense of engaging in an activity which is unclean, and out of that guilt can come the obvious problems of impotence, premature ejaculation, frigidity, to name only the three most obvious. When religion acts to attack and to subdue human self-assertiveness, human self-esteem, in tending or encouraging to push feelings of guilt onto people, to do everything possible to sabotage the healthy development of human self-esteem. This can produce sexual neuroses of the kind which I have mentioned. It can also lead people who accept the doctrine that sex is evil to be attracted to partners whom they consider evil, because partners whom they admire they would rule out for sex. And then you get the classic problem of the man who is impotent with a woman he admires and potent only with the slut, you see, or the prostitute. That's another kind of problem which religion can generate. If you accept the notion that sex is evil, then you don't offend a good woman by engaging in sex with her. You have to find somebody who is low and depraved with whom you can be at home and, quote, be yourself. But the attraction to partners whom you despise generates additional guilt feelings and so tends to reinforce the religious teachings that the whole sexual impulse is by nature low. That's how they get you, you see. If you accept the initial premise, you are very likely to be led into sexual activities that are not going to make you feel too proud of yourself. And then the guilt and the sense of uncleanliness reinforces the initial religious premise that sex is evil, which is the trap they want you to fall into. I'm reminded of a very tragic case. A boy came to me when he was 18 years old. He was near suicidal in guilt over his homosexual feelings. And he described very vividly the onset of this whole chain of reactions. He was 16 years old, and he was raised in a fervently Catholic home. And the Catholic religion in particular, of course, is deadly in the attitudes it communicates towards sex. Well, anyway, he was taught that one must love God more than anything else, and that one must not have any emotional loyalty higher than God or that can even remotely compete with one's emotional loyalty to God. At the age of 16, he came face to face with the fact that he emotionally felt much more involved with women than he did with God. And when that realization became conscious, it became the occasion of the most crushing, murderous guilt. And it totally paralyzed him sexually relative to the opposite sex, because that became for him practically the symbol of his hopeless, irredeemable evil. But since he did have sexual needs, they required an outlet. And so, after a while, and to his horror, he began to find the outlet carrying him in the only alternative direction, namely to members of his own sex. That somehow didn't feel as much like, quote, real sex, unquote. Therefore, didn't seem as evil, didn't seem as terrifying, do you see? Well, I could give many other examples, but anything which damns human self-esteem and damns enjoyment on earth, such as religion does, is, to repeat, guaranteed to produce for those who accept it every kind of sexual neurosis that you can think of. And one of the very interesting aspects, I wish there was time to get into this more perhaps, because we could practically build a whole seminar record around it, is the fact that many of the most extreme types of sexual perversion, flagellation, sadomasochism, and others often derive an awful lot of their force, get generated out of profound feelings of evil associated with sex, which in turn leads to, on the part of those, again, who accept this fallacious doctrine, an emotional sexual attraction to whatever they consider evil. So that the thrust of the religious view is, in fact, to generate desires, actions, impulses, which the possessors recognize as depraved and hold because they are depraved. They feel sex is evil, I'm evil, being a sexual being, the evil is all that fits me, the evil is all that is appropriate for me, and you get the kind of attraction to depravity syndrome. Yes?
Mr. Branden, could you discuss non-religious sources of guilt feelings about sex?
Well, certainly the overall view of sex as being inherently evil has its roots in religion. But that doesn't mean that anybody who feels guilt over any aspect of his sexual activity is under the influence of religion. In other words, a person who is totally atheistic and quite free of the influence of religion indirectly as well as directly still has the power to behave irrationally, still has the power to behave irresponsibly, still has the power to do things which he knows are wrong, are dishonest, are exploitative of another human being, are vicious, and if these activities extend into the realm of sex, it's not surprising that he will feel some kind of guilt over his activity. So that just because you are not influenced by religion doesn't mean that you can't be neurotic on other grounds, of course. And if you can be, why then you can bring this neurosis into your sex life, and you can do things that you know are irrational, are unfair perhaps to another human being, are expressive of your own self-doubts or your own fears or your own hostilities. For example, if you have a neurosis, and the consequence of which is that you rape a 12-year-old girl, let us say, why then you may very well feel guilty over this without holding the religious view that sex inherently is evil, but the kind of sex you're practicing sure is nothing to be proud of. So don't assume that if you reject the religious view, it follows from that you can do nothing wrong, or that anything one chooses to do is okay. There are still standards of rationality and sanity which apply in sex, like in every other realm.